Hello, in this presentation I'm going to be talking about tonal variation in Korean dialects. Tonal languages are languages that utilize pitch to affect the meanings of words and contrast between members of minimal pairs. Examples of tonal languages include various Chinese dialects, Vietnamese, and Thai. And this isn't strictly relevant to the presentation, but I did find it interesting, so I wanted to include it. A research study in 2015 found that tonal languages are more likely to develop in humid climates rather than arid ones. And they believed this was due to moist air keeping the vocal folds and the larynx hydrated, which makes it easier to reliably produce specific pitches and allows for the rise of tonal variation within these languages. Modern Korean as a whole isn't considered to be a tonal language. However, Middle Korean from the 10th century to the end of the 16th century was tonal. In Middle Korean, the first pitch of a noun or a verb stem was distinctive, and it aided to that contrasted meaning between minimal pairs. It did have a very interesting quality, a very unique quality, however. Subsequent pitches after those first few meaningful initial ones were governed more by autonomic rules of prosody rather than a meaningful variation. And that's what gave Middle Korean such a distinctive musical sing-song-like tone. Another important note is that tones in Middle Korean were most likely absolutely distinctive, meaning they could be understood outside of the context of the sentence. There were three main tones in Middle Korean: the even tone, which was monotone, the going tone, which was a higher pitch, and the rising tone. The rising tone, the syllable would start out at a lower tone and it would increase to a high tone within that same syllable. With the invention of Hangul in 1446, tones were marked within the written text. Low tones were not marked. That was unnecessary. It was understood that they would be a low tone without a mark. High tones, though, were marked with a single dot to the left of the affected syllable or word. Rising tones were marked with two dots to the left of the affected syllable. There are 6 major modern dialects in Korean. In this presentation, the two that we're most concerned about are the Gyeongsang dialect and the Hamgyong dialect, one in South Korea, one in North Korea. Both of these have tonal distinctions and are, for the most part, without vowel length distinctions. Other dialects in Korea, for the most part, are without tonal distinctions, and for the most part, they have vowel length distinctions. A notable exception is the Jeju dialect, which has neither suprasegmental. And then there are areas scattered throughout both South and North Korea who similarly have neither the distinguishing features. And then there are a few very unique regions that utilize both, and we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. Okay. Tones and vowel length are complementary within Korean, meaning that they share similar functions and don't, in most cases, coexist within a dialect. Examples of how vowel length might be used in a word are with the word mal, which would mean horse with a short vowel. With a long vowel, it would mean speech. Nim with a short vowel could mean I. With a long vowel, it could mean snow. With a short vowel could mean night. With a long vowel, it would be chestnut. And then for dialects that utilize tonal differences, this could be the case. Mal with a high tone could be horse. With a mid-tone, it could mean court. With a low or a rising tone, it could mean speech. Bear with a high tone could mean pear. Mid-tone could be ship or belly. And with a low or rising tone, it could be double. Again, there are a few instances where both vowel length and tone exist, like the North Gyeongsang dialect. And in that case, mal with an even tone with a short vowel could mean court. Mal with a high tone could mean horse. And then with a lengthened vowel, that could mean speech or language. There are some major differences between modern Korean tonal variation and Middle Korean tonal variation. One of the biggest is the absence of the automatic variation that was so distinctive to Middle Korean. In modern Korean tonal dialects, once a pitch falls in the phrase, it tends to remain low throughout the remainder of the phrase. Another important contrast is that modern dialects have relative pitch rather than absolute pitch, meaning that you do need the context of the sentence to understand the full meaning of the tonal variation. And then an obvious difference is that the pitch is no longer represented within Hangul text. There are also some major differences between the tonal dialects of Korean. One of those is that the meaning of specific variations differs between regions. For instance, in the Hamgyong dialect, mal with a high tone could mean language or court, but in North Gyeongsang, the same thing could mean horse. Bear in Hamgyong could mean belly, and the same thing in North Gyeongsang would mean pear. The three tones from Middle Korean are retained in modern Korean dialects. North Gyeongsang is the exception. They do not have the rising tone that was part of the Middle Korean tonal variation. And to fill that gap, they do have the vowel length distinction. Okay, we're going to conclude with a brief note on the perceptions of tones. So for native Korean speakers who come from non-tonal dialects, tones tend to sound a lot more coarse, and they tend to be perceived as sounding more argumentative. The converse is not true for vowel length. Vowel length distinctions leave less of an impression on those who come from tonal speaking dialects, and vowel length is less characteristic of dialects that have it. Another interesting note is that vowel lengths tend to be on the decline with the younger generations. Those from younger generations typically use them less to distinguish between minimal pairs, and it could be that they are on the way out of the language, and tonal variation could be on the way to becoming the main supersegmental within the Korean dialects. And then another thing to note is that non-native, non-heritage speakers tend to have difficulty perceiving and using both the supersegmental distinctions, especially if those supersegmentals are not present in their native language. For instance, English is a stress accent language, so we do not use pitch in quite the same way, and it can be difficult for us to pick up on those pitch variations. The same is true for those vowel length distinctions as well. And then here are my sources, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.